The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of late August humidity, diesel exhaust, and the sweet, sad smell of rust. It was 1976. Men in seed corn caps and sweat-stained work shirts stood in tight knots, their voices a low murmur against the auctioneer's rhythmic chant. They were picking over the bones of a life's work, a farm that had gone under, not from bad luck, but from a son who didn't want it. I stood at the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn jeans, feeling the smooth, cool metal of the half-dozen lug nuts I always seemed to carry. My name is Jedediah Stone. I was 26, and I was a ghost at my own generation's party. While other young men were marching into the Farmers National Bank to sign their lives away for shiny new green and red iron, I was trying to keep my father's legacy running on cash, sweat, and scavenged parts. Dad had left me the 240 acres free and clear, along with a simple, stern piece of advice hammered into me since I was old enough to hold a wrench. If you can't pay for it in cash, son, you don't own it. It owns you. The auctioneer was working his way down the machinery line. A John Deere 4020, clean but with high hours, went for a price that made my throat tighten. A nearly new International 1066 with a cab and jewels fetched a king's ransom. The men bidding were my age, their faces flushed with the thrill of expansion. Corn was over $3 a bushel, land prices were climbing every month, and the banks were throwing money around like confetti at a wedding. It was a gold rush, and I was the fool standing on the sidelines with an empty pan. My own fleet was a testament to my father's philosophy. A 1951 Farmall M, reliable as a sunrise, was my main tillage tractor. For planting and lighter work, I had a John Deere Model A that my grandfather had bought new. They were paid for. They were simple enough that I could fix anything on them with the tools in my own shop. But they were small. They were slow. And in the eyes of my peers, they were relics. Leading that pack of modern farmers was Richard Peterson. Rick's father had co-signed a note that made him the talk of the county. He'd started with a brand new John Deere 4430, a 6-bottom plow, and a new 6-row planter. He farmed 1,000 acres, all of it rented or mortgaged. He drove a new Ford pickup, wore clean clothes to the diner, and always had a condescending smirk ready for me. He saw my cautiousness not as wisdom, but as a lack of grit. Next up, folks, we got this thing. The auctioneer's voice crackled over the PA system, dripping with disdain. He was pointing to the last item in the line, a hulking beast of a machine shoved off to the side in the weeds. It was a tractor, but unlike any I'd seen up close. It was an early Wagner, a true four-wheel drive articulated tractor from the late 1950s. It was enormous, sitting on 4 bald, cracked 24.532 tires that were as tall as my chest. The sheet metal was a patchwork of faded industrial yellow and angry orange rust. A thick spiderweb radiated from a crack in one of the windshield panes. It had no cab to speak of, just a simple seat and a forest of stiff, frozen levers. It looked like it had been dragged out of a riverbed. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. "What in the hell is that?" someone shouted. "Scrap iron by the pound," another voice answered, and more men chuckled. Rick Peterson, standing near the front with his arms crossed, turned and caught my eye. He gestured toward the Wagner with his chin, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Hey, Jed," he called out, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "There's one that's your speed, probably runs on steam." The laughter grew louder. My face burned, a hot flush of anger and embarrassment. I ignored him and focused on the machine. I'd read about these early articulated tractors in the farm magazines. They were crude, powerful beasts built with off-the-shelf truck and industrial parts, heavy-duty axles, simple transfer cases, and big diesel engines. They were designed to pull, nothing more. This one had a Cummins engine. You could just make out the faded logo on the valve cover beneath a decade of grime and bird droppings. "All right, what am I bid for this piece of history?" the auctioneer chirped, trying to make a joke of it. "Let's start it at $1,000 for scrap value. Who'll give me 1,000? Silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the dry cornstalks in the field next to us. "Come on now, boys. The axles alone are worth that. $500. Who'll start it at 500? More silence. Rick Peterson shook his head dramatically, as if offended by the very presence of the machine. I saw the potential under the rust. I saw the massive planetary hubs, the heavy-duty frame that pivoted in the middle, the sheer pulling power locked away in that seized engine. In my mind's eye, I saw it pulling a 24-foot chisel plow, doing the work of 3 of my old Farmall M's. I saw myself working my ground in half the time, getting the crop in before the spring rains or getting the fall tillage done before the first snow. It was a long shot, a massive gamble, but it wouldn't be a gamble on the bank's terms. It would be on mine. $200, I said, my voice quiet but clear in the lull. Every head turned to look at me. The auctioneer squinted, locating me at the back of the crowd. I got $200 from the young man in the back. $200, now who'll give me 3? Rick Peterson let out a theatrical sigh. Someone ought to put him out of his misery. $300, he said, not even looking at the auctioneer, but staring right at me. It wasn't a real bid, it was a taunt. He was driving up the price on a joke, just to make me pay more for my foolishness. $400, I shot back immediately. My heart was starting to pound. This was more than I'd planned. $5, Rick said, his smile tightening. The game was on. The crowd was loving it. This was better than the bidding on the good equipment. This was a spectacle. The old-timer versus the new kid. The pauper versus the prince. $600, I said, my voice tight. I was doing the math in my head. The tires were shot. That was $1,000 right there if I couldn't find used ones. The engine was a complete unknown. $7, Rick snapped back. He was enjoying this, playing to the crowd. I took a deep breath. I thought of my father. I thought of the long hours ahead, the busted knuckles, the cold nights in the shop. I thought of the smug look on Rick's face. $800, I said. My voice didn't waver. That was it. That was every spare dollar I had in the world. Rick held my gaze for a long moment. The smirk on his face was a permanent fixture. He could have easily bid $1,000 just to make me walk away with nothing but humiliation. But he was too smart for that. Winning the bid meant he'd have to haul the piece of junk away. It was more fun to let me win, to let me be the fool who dragged it home. He slowly, deliberately shook his head. He can have it, he announced to the crowd. Gonna need a museum to put it in. The auctioneer, sensing the show was over, moved quickly. $800 from Mr. Stone, sold for $800. He slammed his gavel down and a wave of snickers rolled through the men around me. I walked to the clerk's trailer on legs that felt like wood, my stomach churning. I counted out the cash, 16 $50 bills that I had earmarked for a new set of tires for the Model A. As the clerk handed me the receipt, I could feel Rick Peterson's eyes on my back, and I could hear the whispers. Poor Jed. His dad must be rolling in his grave. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. Have you ever taken a gamble on something that everyone else told you was worthless? A car, a machine, maybe even a piece of land that everyone else had written off. Tell me about it down in the comments, because I think a lot of us have been in that exact spot, with the whole world watching and waiting for us to fail. Getting the Wagner home was an ordeal that became a local legend. It was dead weight, all 30,000 pounds of it. The tires were flat and dry-rotted, the brakes were seized, and the steering was frozen solid. I had to hire a local heavy hauler, a gruff old man named Gus, who showed up with a winch truck and a lowboy trailer. He took one look at the tractor and shook his head. "You paid money for this, Jed," he grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot asphalt. $800, I said, trying to sound confident. Gus just laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "Well, it's your funeral. It's going to cost you $150 just to get it to your place." That was another blow, but I had no choice. It took us 4 hours to winch the stubborn beast onto the trailer. The steel cable groaned and popped, stretching tight as a fiddle string. We had to use pry bars and hydraulic jacks to break the rusted brake drums free. The whole time, a steady stream of traffic slowed on the county road, farmers heading home from the auction. I could see them pointing, shaking their heads, their wives beside them in the passenger seats, looking on with pity. By the time we finally had it loaded, I was covered in grease, sweat, and shame. The journey to my farm was a slow, nerve-wracking crawl. The Wagner was wider than the trailer, and its immense weight made the truck's engine labor on even the slightest grade. When we finally pulled into my lane, the real work began. Getting it off was even harder than getting it on. Gus, to his credit, earned his money, but by the time the Wagner sat squatting behind my machine shed, daylight was gone, and so was most of my remaining cash. It sat there in the moonlight, looking even more derelict and hopeless than it had at the auction. It was a monument to my folly. That winter of '76 was a long and bitter one. While other farmers were down in Florida or just taking it easy, I was in my unheated shop, waging a one-man war against rust and time. I started the teardown on the 1st of December. The shop was a simple pole building with a dirt floor and a single pot-bellied stove in the corner that ate wood like a monster and gave off about as much heat as a lit match. Every bolt was a battle. I'd heat them cherry red with the acetylene torch until they glowed like angry eyes in the dim light, then quench them with penetrating oil that would hiss and boil, sending up clouds of acrid smoke. Then I'd put a 6-foot cheetah pipe on a breaker bar and throw my entire body weight into it, praying the bolt would break loose before the socket shattered. My knuckles were a permanent road map of cuts, scrapes, and blood blisters. The smell of that shop became the smell of my life: cold steel, stale gear oil, mouse nests, and the sharp tang of the cutting torch. I pulled the engine first. It was a Cummins NH220, a legendary workhorse of an engine. Getting it out required building a gantry crane out of old I-beams and using 2 chain hoists working in tandem. The day it finally swung free of the frame, I felt a surge of triumph that was quickly smothered by the sheer scale of the task ahead. I tore it down on a set of wooden stands, piece by piece. The diagnosis wasn't good. Water had gotten into the number 4 cylinder through a rusted-out exhaust stack. The piston was seized solid to the cylinder liner, a bond of rust that seemed unbreakable. For a week, I soaked it in every concoction I could think of. Diesel fuel, transmission fluid, a special penetrating oil I'd bought with my grocery money. Nothing worked. The coffee shop talk was relentless. "Heard Jed Stone's trying to get that old junker running," they'd say over their morning coffee at the diner. Poor kid's got more ambition than sense. Rick Peterson was a regular there, holding court. "I saw him the other day," he'd announced to the table. "Looked like a chimney sweep. He's going to pour more money into that scrap heap than a new tractor would have cost him on payments." They didn't understand. The payments were the enemy. The interest was the poison. My father had seen it in the 50s, a neighbor who'd overextended himself and lost everything. The memory was seared into his mind, and he'd passed that fear, that healthy respect for debt, on to me. Finally, I got the piston out. It took a 20-ton hydraulic press and a block of oak, and it came out with a gunshot crack that echoed through the silent farmyard. The cylinder liner was ruined, deeply pitted and scored. The piston itself looked like a relic from a shipwreck. The crankshaft, thankfully, was still good, but it would need to be polished. The head had 2 cracked valves. The fuel pump was a mystery, the injectors were likely shot, and the turbocharger was seized solid. It was a nightmare. I spent my nights poring over parts manuals I'd ordered through the mail, my fingers black with grease as I turned the pages. I spent my days on the phone, calling salvage yards in 3 states, hunting for a used cylinder liner, for valves, for an injection pump rebuild kit. Each part was a small victory, paid for with money I made plowing snow for the neighbors with my old farm awl. Every dollar I earned went right back into the belly of the beast. By March, as the first thaws of spring began to turn the farmyard into a muddy soup, I was starting to see a glimmer of light. I had honed the other 5 cylinders myself, using a ball hone on a slow-speed drill until the crosshatch pattern was perfect. I'd found a used liner at a truck graveyard in Des Moines and pressed it into the block after freezing it overnight in my mother's deep freeze to make it shrink just enough to slide in. I lapped the new valves into the head by hand, using grinding compound and a suction cup on a stick, working until my arms ached and the seal was perfect. I checked the main and rod bearing clearances with green plastigauge, torquing the caps down, then removing them to check the width of the crushed wax line against the paper gauge. Everything was within spec. As I was reassembling the engine, bolting on the freshly painted Cummins beige oil pan, Rick Peterson drove by. He slowed his new pickup to a crawl, rolling down the passenger window. He wasn't smiling this time. He just stared at the engine block hanging from the gantry, then at me. He shook his head slowly, a look of genuine pity on his face, and drove on. He didn't understand. He saw a man wasting his time on junk. I saw salvation being built one bolt at a time. He saw a pile of old iron. I saw freedom. The world outside my little workshop was going crazy. The late 1970s had arrived, and with them an agricultural boom the likes of which no one had ever seen. The Russian wheat deal had opened the floodgates. Grain prices, which had been stable for years, suddenly shot for the moon. Corn hit $3.50, then $4 a bushel. Soybeans were trading at prices that seemed like fantasy just a few years earlier. Suddenly, every farmer was flush with cash, and the banks were practically begging them to take out loans. The mantra from the universities and the farm magazines was simple and seductive. Get big or get out. Leverage your assets. Expand. Rick Peterson became the poster boy for the new era. He was no longer just the kid with the new tractor. He was a young tycoon. The soaring price of his crops and the skyrocketing value of his land gave him immense borrowing power. The first thing he did was buy the 160 acres that bordered my farm to the east, paying a price per acre that made old-timers gasp. He didn't pay cash, of course. He mortgaged it to the hilt, but the banker, Mr. Henderson, slapped him on the back and called him a visionary. Next, he traded in his 4430, which barely had 500 hours on it, for the biggest two-wheel drive tractor John Deere made. A 4840, it was a monster, pushing 200 horsepower. But even that wasn't enough. A year later, leveraging his expanding land holdings again, he bought a brand new John Deere 8640, an articulated four-wheel drive with jewels on all four corners. It was a spaceship compared to my Wagner. It had a sound guard cab that was whisper quiet, air conditioning, a tape deck, and more lights than a runway. He built a new 60 by 120-foot machine shed to house his growing fleet and a new grain leg with a massive drying bin. He was the undisputed king of the county. Meanwhile, I was still in my greasy coveralls. In late May of 1978, the day finally came. I had the engine back in the Wagner's frame. The fuel system was bled, the oil pans were full, and a fresh battery was hooked up. I'd spent 2 years of my life and every spare cent I had on this moment. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I climbed up onto the steel seat, took a deep breath and turned the key. The starter motor groaned, a deep guttural sound. The massive engine turned over slowly, once, twice, fighting against the compression of its 6 huge cylinders. A puff of white smoke coughed from the makeshift exhaust pipe. I held the key, feeding the starter. It turned again, faster this time. Then, with a deafening roar, the Cummins engine fired. It didn't just start, it erupted. A huge cloud of black and grey smoke billowed from the stack, blotting out the sun and covering the side of my shop in a layer of soot. The ground beneath my feet trembled. The whole tractor shook with a raw, violent power that I could feel in my bones. It wasn't the refined hum of Rick's new Deere. It was the angry, thundering bellow of a waking giant. I let it idle for a minute, the deep, loping rhythm of the big diesel filling the air. I looked at the oil pressure gauge. The needle was steady, right in the green. A grin split my face, the first genuine soul-deep grin I'd had in 2 years. I had done it. I spent the next month working out the bugs. The transmission needed new seals, the hydraulics were weak until I rebuilt the pump, and one of the planetary hubs had a bad bearing that I had to replace. I couldn't afford a professional paint job, so I bought 5 gallons of industrial yellow enamel from the co-op and painted it myself with a brush and a roller. It was ugly. The brush strokes were visible and there were runs in the paint. But it was protected. I found a set of used but decent tires at a salvage yard and spent a week wrestling them onto the rims by myself with slide hammers and tire irons. I named the tractor the Titan. That fall, I put it to the test. I'd bought a used 24-foot chisel plow, an implement my Farmall M couldn't even dream of pulling. I dropped the plow into the hard, dry ground of my corn stubble, throttled the Titan up, and let out the clutch. The tractor didn't even grunt. It dug in its 4 massive tires and pulled that plow a foot deep, tearing through the soil, leaving a wake of black, rich earth behind it. I could cover more ground in 1 hour than I used to in a full day. I was working smarter, not just harder. But to the outside world, I was still Jed Stone, the eccentric fool. My tractor, with its lumpy paint job and loud smoky engine, was a joke compared to Rick's gleaming fleet. While he was buying more land, I was content with my 240 acres. While he was driving a new truck, I was still patching the rust on my old Ford. I was saving money, putting it in the bank, and paying cash for my fuel and supplies. I was debt-free, but I looked poor. The boom was lifting every other boat in the county, and I was seen as the man who was stubbornly standing on the dock, refusing to get in. One evening, I was at the co-op filling a drum with diesel fuel. Rick Peterson pulled up next to me in his new truck. He got out and leaned against his fender, watching the fuel pump. "Still tinkering with that old relic, Jed?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "She runs good," I said, not looking at him, "pulls like a freight train." He chuckled. "Yeah, but that's all it does. You know, Henderson down at the bank was asking about you. He said he could get you set up with a quarter section next to yours. Interest rates are still manageable, and with land prices like this, you can't lose. You're missing the boat, man. You could be somebody." "I'm happy with what I've got, Rick," I said, clicking off the fuel nozzle. "Happy doesn't pay the bills," he scoffed. "You got to grow. It's the American way." He pushed himself off the fender. "Suit yourself. Some guys are just meant to stay small." He got in his truck and drove off, leaving me in his dust. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, looking out over my fields. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows. Across the fence, on the farm Rick had just bought, a crew was installing a new center pivot irrigation system, another massive investment on borrowed money. In the distance, I could hear the hum of his grain dryer running long into the night. It all looked so impressive, so successful. Then the late news came on the radio. The announcer's voice was grim. He was talking about inflation, about the Federal Reserve. A man named Paul Volcker had just been appointed chairman. The announcer said Volcker was promising to break the back of inflation no matter the cost. He mentioned something about raising the prime interest rate. It was just a small story, buried between a crop report and the local sports, but it sent a cold chill down my spine. I looked at my paid-for land, thought of my ugly paid-for tractor, and a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The sun had set completely now, and the shadows stretching across Rick Peterson's new ground looked an awful lot like the bars of a cage. The words of that radio broadcast in the fall of 1979 were the first pebbles of an avalanche. For the next year, life went on. The boom, fueled by sheer momentum and denial, continued. Corn prices stayed high enough to mask the trouble brewing underneath. Rick Peterson, like everyone else, saw the rising interest rates as a temporary problem, a city dweller's concern that couldn't possibly touch the rich black soil of the heartland. He doubled down, buying another 80 acres on a contract with a balloon payment due in 5 years. He was convinced land would never be this cheap again. I spent that time solidifying my position. The Titan had changed my farm's arithmetic. I could get my full tillage done in a third of the time, which meant I could do custom chisel plowing for 2 of my older neighbors who were still farming with smaller equipment. They paid me in cash. That money didn't go toward a new truck or a vacation. It went into a savings account at the bank, earning a modest interest rate that was, for the first time, starting to look respectable. I kept my life simple. I patched the liner in my work boots with shoe goo, I packed my own lunch, and I kept my machinery meticulously maintained. The first real crack in the facade appeared in the spring of 1981. We were in the middle of a wet planting season, fighting the calendar to get the corn in. I was working a field one afternoon when I saw Rick's massive John Deere 8640 sitting silent in the middle of his field, halfway through a pass. It stayed there for the rest of the day. The next morning, the John Deere dealer's service truck was parked beside it. I saw the mechanic, a young guy named Dave, at the parts counter a few days later. He looked exhausted. "What's wrong with Peterson's 8640?" I asked, sliding a new hydraulic filter across the counter. Dave sighed and ran a greasy hand through his hair. "The quad-range transmission is shot. Something let go in the planetary gear set. It's a complete teardown. The tractor has to be split in half right there in the field." "What's a job like that cost?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. He winced. "With parts and our labor rate, he'll be lucky to get out of it for under $12,000. And we're waiting on parts. He'll be down for another week at least." $12,000. That was more than I had paid for my entire fleet of machinery, including the Titan and the mountain of parts I'd bought for its engine. A week of downtime in the middle of planting season was a catastrophe. Rick ended up having to hire a custom operator to finish his corn, paying a premium price while his own brand-new six-figure tractor sat in pieces like a patient in open-heart surgery. My own turning point came a week later. I was pulling my 6-row planter with my old John Deere A, the same tractor my grandfather had used. It wasn't fast, but it was steady. Suddenly, the engine sputtered and died. I smelled raw diesel. I climbed down, opened the side panel, and saw a fine mist spraying from the injector line for the number 1 cylinder. A hairline crack had formed from years of vibration. My heart didn't even sink. This wasn't a crisis, it was just a Tuesday. I drove my pickup back to the shop, dug through a coffee can full of old fittings, and found a replacement line I'd salvaged from a junked tractor years ago. I drove back to the field, and with a single half-inch wrench, I had the old line off and the new one on in less than 15 minutes. I bled the air out of the system, and the old 2-cylinder engine popped back to life, settling into its familiar, rhythmic cadence. The total cost of the repair was $0. The total downtime was under an hour. As I climbed back on the seat and put the tractor in gear, I looked across the fence line at Rick's silent, dissected 8640, and I understood the difference between being modern and being durable. By 1982, the world had changed. Paul Volcker had kept his promise. The prime interest rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, had soared to over 20%. The variable rate loans that farmers like Rick had signed in the 70s were now ticking time bombs. A loan signed at 8% was now demanding 18, then 20, then 21% interest. It was like trying to run in quicksand. The grain embargo and a worldwide recession had crushed commodity prices. Corn, which had been over $3, was struggling to stay above $2. The confident swagger vanished from the coffee shop. The talk was no longer about expansion and new equipment. It was hushed, fearful whispers about interest payments that were now larger than the principal. Men who had been hailed as kings of agriculture just a few years before now sat staring into their coffee cups, their faces etched with worry. The banker, Mr. Henderson, who used to greet his customers with a booming laugh and a slap on the back, now stayed in his office with the door closed. The notices started appearing in the paper, small print in the legal section, announcing foreclosure auctions. First it was 1, then 3, then a dozen. An epidemic of failure was sweeping the prairie. Rick Peterson's empire, built on the sand of cheap credit, began to crumble. His operating note for seed and fertilizer was renewed at a staggering 19%. He couldn't afford the payment on his new grain bin, so he was forced to sell his corn right out of the field at harvest time when the price was at its lowest. He tried to sell his 4840 tractor to raise cash, but the market was flooded. Used equipment lots were overflowing with late-model machinery from bankrupt farms. He was offered less than half of what he owed on it. The final blow was the land. The very asset that had been his ladder to the sky became his anchor to the abyss. Land that had been valued at $4,000 an acre in 1980 was now impossible to sell for $1,500. His net worth had evaporated. He was technically bankrupt, but the bank was carrying him, hoping for a miracle, because foreclosing meant they would have to take a massive loss on their books. Rick was a ghost, haunting his own farm. The new pickup was gone, replaced by a beat-up 10-year-old Chevy. He lost weight and dark circles formed under his eyes. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by a permanent hunted look. I saw him one day at the co-op. He was trying to buy a bag of seed corn, and the manager was telling him, quietly but firmly, that his account was cash only. Rick didn't have the cash. He just stood there, his head bowed, as other farmers averted their eyes and pretended not to notice. I walked up to the counter, pulled out my wallet, and paid for his seed. "I'll pay you back, Jed," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I know you will," I said. It was the first time we'd spoken in over a year. I survived those years because my father's lessons had been my shield. My cost of production was a fraction of my neighbor's. I had no interest payments. My property taxes were my biggest bill. While others were selling their corn for $2 a bushel and losing money on every acre, my break-even price was closer to $1.50. I wasn't getting rich, but I was banking a small profit. I was solvent. My ugly, home-built tractor, the Titan, had become my workhorse and my salvation. It burned less fuel per acre than the new tractors, and when it broke down, I could fix it with my own 2 hands and parts I could find in a truck salvage yard. While others were chained to their dealership service departments, I was free. The spring of 1985 was cold and bleak. The notice appeared in the paper, just as everyone knew it eventually would. The Farmers National Bank was foreclosing on the assets of Richard Peterson. The auction was scheduled for the first Saturday in April. It was the death of a dream, and the entire county was coming to watch. The air at the Peterson Farm auction was colder and sharper than it had been at the Miller auction nearly a decade before. A bitter April wind whipped across the yard, carrying not the smell of hope and diesel, but the scent of damp earth and despair. The crowd was different too. The faces weren't flushed with the excitement of expansion. They were pale and grim. These men were here not to celebrate success, but to witness the final brutal consequence of failure. They were looking at Rick's machinery line, but they were seeing their own future. Rick stood beside his wife near the porch of the farmhouse his grandfather had built. He was a scarecrow of a man, his work jacket hanging loose on his shrunken frame. His wife's eyes were red-rimmed, but she stood tall, her arm linked through his, a portrait of prairie defiance in the face of ruin. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. He just stared at the auctioneer, his face a blank mask of shock. The auctioneer, the same man from all those years ago, had no joy in his voice today. His chant was flat, mechanical, a funeral dirge for a farm. He started with the small items, tools from the shop, livestock equipment, grain augers. They sold for pennies on the dollar. Men who desperately needed a wrench or a welder couldn't afford to bid. The bank was there, represented by a grim-faced man in a suit who watched everything, his arms crossed, ensuring they recovered what little they could. Then came the machinery. The John Deere 8640, the symbol of Rick's ambition, looked pathetic. A film of dust covered its green paint, one of its huge dual tires was flat, and a bird had built a nest in the engine compartment. The dealer had fixed the transmission, but Rick had never been able to pay the bill in full, so they had placed a mechanic's lien on it. It was a tangled mess of debt and broken promises. The bidding was slow, agonizing. It finally sold for a fraction of what Rick had paid to an out-of-state salvage dealer who would likely part it out. I stood at the back, just as I had years ago, my hands in my pockets. But this time the feeling was different. There was no anger, no embarrassment. There was only a profound sadness, a sense of waste. The men who had once snickered at me now nodded in my direction, their eyes holding a new respect. I was the one who had made it, the fool on the hill who had turned out to be the prophet. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the last, most important item. "All right, folks," he said, his voice heavy. "Now for the real estate. We'll be offering the home quarter, 160 acres with house and buildings." A hush fell over the crowd. This was the heart of it, the land. The Peterson family had worked this ground for 3 generations. Selling it was like selling a piece of their soul. Mr. Henderson, the banker, stepped forward. He looked 10 years older than he had in the 70s. He announced the starting bid, a number dictated by the remaining balance of Rick's mortgage. It was a high price for the depressed market, but it was what the bank needed to avoid a total catastrophe. The auctioneer asked for an opening bid. Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. No one moved. No one spoke. The price was too high. The local farmers who had survived were in no position to expand. They were clinging to what they had. It looked like the bank would end up owning the farm, a fate almost as sad as the foreclosure itself. I saw Rick's wife finally break. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Rick put his arm around her, his own eyes glistening. This was it. The end of the line. I took a deep breath. I thought of my father's words, "It owns you." I thought of the years of ridicule, the cold nights in the shop, the busted knuckles. I thought of the quiet satisfaction of being free, and I thought of the look on Rick's face at the co-op. a look of utter defeat that no man should ever have to wear. My victory didn't need to be his complete destruction. I raised my hand. "I'll bid," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Every head swiveled toward me. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Rick's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Henderson stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The auctioneer found me. "I have a bid from Mr. Jedediah Stone." He tried to get another bid. He looked around the crowd, but no one else would challenge me. They knew this was more than a business transaction. This was the closing of a circle. "Sold," the auctioneer finally cried, his gavel falling with a hollow thud. "To Jedediah Stone." I didn't buy the farm to evict him. I walked over to Rick through the parting crowd. He looked at me, his eyes full of a confusion and shame so deep it was hard to witness. "Why, Jed?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "After everything. Why?" "Because this is your home, Rick," I said, my voice low. "It always will be. I'm not a landlord. I need a good farm manager. I'll pay you a fair wage, and you and your family can stay in the house. We'll work this land together." He stared at me, and for the first time in years, the hard, defensive shell around him shattered. His shoulders slumped, and he began to sob, not loud, but with the deep, racking sobs of a man who had been carrying an impossible weight for too long. His wife put her hand on my arm. "Thank you," was all she could say. Life found a new rhythm after that. Rick was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He was also a hell of a farmer. Freed from the crushing stress of debt, his natural talent for agronomy blossomed. He knew soil, he knew crops, and together we made that farm more productive than it had ever been. We became partners, then friends. I continued to expand, but I did it my way. When a neighboring farm came up for sale, I'd wait. I'd let the speculators and the big operators fight it out. Then, when the economy turned, or a deal fell through, I'd step in and make a fair offer, always in cash. My 240 acres grew to 500, then 1,000, then more. I bought modern equipment, but only when I could afford it, and I always favored simplicity and durability over bells and whistles. The Titan remained the heart of the fleet. I eventually gave it a proper restoration, sandblasting it down to bare metal and painting it the correct industrial yellow. I rebuilt the engine again, not because it needed it, but because I wanted it to be perfect. It sat in the front of my main machine shed, a monument not to my foolishness, but to my philosophy. Years passed. The farm crisis faded into memory, becoming stories old men told to scare the young. My hair turned from brown to grey. I married a good woman from town, and we raised 2 children on that farm, a son and a daughter. When my son, Daniel, was about 16, full of the fire and ambition of youth, he came to me in the shop. He'd been looking through dealership brochures, his eyes wide with excitement at the new tractors, machines that made Rick's old 8640 look like an antique. They were filled with GPS, computers and transmissions so complex they required a laptop to diagnose. "Dad," he said, "we could be so much more efficient with this new stuff. We could farm another 500 acres. We could lease one of these. The payments wouldn't be that bad." I didn't get angry. I just wiped my hands on a rag and walked him over to the front of the shed, to where the Titan stood, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Come here," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. I pointed to the massive Cummins engine. "You see that? That's 6 cylinders, a fuel pump, and a turbocharger. There isn't a single computer chip in it. We can rebuild that entire engine right here on this floor with tools from that toolbox." I patted the thick steel of the fender. "This tractor cost me $800 and 2 years of my life. It was the best investment I ever made, not because of what it did in the field, but because of what it taught me. It taught me that the most important thing you can own is yourself. The moment you owe the bank for a machine like this," I said, tapping the glossy brochure in his hand, "it's not yours, it's theirs. You become its servant. You work for it, worrying every day about the payment, the interest, the price of corn." I looked him square in the eye. "Your grandfather taught me that debt is a cage with invisible bars. It looks like freedom. It feels like progress. But one day, when the wind changes, you'll find out you're trapped. We'll get a new tractor when we can write a check for it." Not a day before. That's how we stay free. Daniel looked from the brochure to the old Wagner, and I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It was the same look I must have had all those years ago, standing in my cold shop, realizing the truth my father had tried to teach me. The lesson had been passed on. The legacy was secure. Sometimes, on a quiet fall evening when the work is done and the air is crisp, I'll climb up onto the iron seat of the Titan and fire up that old Cummins. Its deep, thundering, idle echoes across the fields. My fields, all paid for. It's the sound of survival. It's the sound of patience. It's the sound of freedom. And it's the best $800 I ever spent.